All right, mic check, I'm good. So I'm Max Ceron, CWB Association Welding podcast. Today we have a really cool guest, Welding podcast.
The show is about to begin.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the CWB Association podcast. My name is Max Ceron, with you guys as always, here to show you guys another interesting story here in Canada, and a wonderful guy that I've met a few times now, and he's doing some cool things out in Alberta. We got Naren Barnes. Did I say your name right? Naren Barnes.
Yeah, you're on bar. That's better than most people do. That's actually bang on, one syllable.
So Naren is in Alberta, and I think you're in Edmonton. Am I correct?
Yeah.
All right, so Nairn has been around the scene for a while. I've seen your name being popping up. I think even when you were in grad school, I would see your name kind of pop up with some of the stuff you were working on. And, we want to have a conversation today, kind of in terms of your career paths. And I mean, I'm picking this topic kind of specifically because it's something that we were like right before the show, it's come up lots in my work. So as the director of the association, sitting in meetings across the country, high-level meetings with companies and agencies, recruitment companies, it's something that keeps coming up, is these incredible shortages of tradespeople that we forecast in the near future, which is crazy. You can hear the jets flying above me. Jets are welded, by the way. So, Nairn, let's start with your story and kind of get to where you are. Where were you born?
So I was born in Edmonton. I actually grew up a little outside of Edmonton, though. I don't know if you've ever been out this way to see some of the area or not, but there's a national park called Elk Island National Park, and my house and the acreage that I grew up on was on one side of the road, and then Elk Island National Park is literally on the other side of the road. So I grew up kind of in the boonies. I wasn't a farm kid, but I grew up sort of in the middle of nowhere and grew up with a lot of nature around me. So that was pretty nice. It was a pretty nice childhood, but it was also, you're pretty far out there, right? So it was, it wasn't like you're going to your buddy's house. We'll just walk across the road. It was like,
is that a really nice way of saying that you were lonely?
No, I had siblings. I had two siblings, so I was okay in that respect, but it was definitely different.
Good. So so you're out in the boonies, just outside of Edmonton. When you went to high school, I assume like everybody else, right?
Yep.
At what point did you start thinking, trades? Because you're an engineer, right? By trade, that's your designation, as you're an engineer. I guess maybe a little bit of backstory. What kind of engineer are you?
So both my degrees are in materials engineering, but I actually work as a welding engineer.
Okay. So I guess, when did that bug or seed start to come into your brain? Like, were you young? Were you in high school, or did it hit you like a truck in university?
For me, it was sort of a weird one, because all the way growing up, I was always a kid who was like, hey, this is my plan in life. And I kind of grew up, and my big plan was I wanted to be a lawyer.
Oh,
it was purely a monetary thing. I had this thing, if I'd met a couple lawyers and I was like, hey, these guys have it pretty good, I want to do that. And then I got a little older into high school, and I remember looking and meeting some actual lawyers and hearing what they did, and I was like, I can't do that. That sounds horrible. So my mom was an engineer. She has a master's in geotechnical engineering. So I had that background. My dad is a technologist as well, and so I had that background. So I thought about engineering, and then I went to a couple open houses, and I kind of figured, hey, I'll go into engineering. No real plan other than, hey, let's see where this takes me. Went through first year, and I actually, it's a little funny, but in the engineering world, in the last decade or so, 15 years really, they've really been pushing this nanotechnology thing, right? And it's just this sort of buzzword that floats around. And so I got a little bit suckered, because first year engineering is just general studies, and then you specialize after that. And so I went to first year engineering, and there were some things that I took away. Like, I took away that I was never going to be a computer engineer. I wasn't great at coding, so I wasn't going to go that route. But materials, we had a little bit of an introduction. You only get really a drive-by in your first year. And I was kind of like, that sounds interesting. And it sounds like I could work in pretty much any field if I went into materials. It was kind of a door opener. And so I was like, I didn't know what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So materials seemed like an easy door opener to open that up and say, hey, you can work pretty much anywhere. Where do you want to specialize? And so I kind of got bamboozled by a professor. He came into our first year classes and he was talking all about nanotechnology and showing the curve of technology and how it's ramping up and all these things. And I got a little bamboozled and I was like, nanotechnology? That sounds cool. Let alone nobody told me, hey, there's no nanotechnology factories. That's not a thing. There's like one in every like 400 graduates from nanotechnology.
It's like all theoretical.
Yeah. If you live in California, go to Caltech. Awesome, but that's about it. So in my second year, actually start of my third year, I actually got a visit to one of my classes, and it was very random. I had a graduate student, or almost graduate student at the time, named Gentry Wood, who I'm sure you're very familiar with and probably listens to the podcast. He came down to our classroom and he said, hey, I have been involved in this welding lab. I would love for some people to come and go for a tour. And so me and my group of friends decided, hey, let's go for a tour. Why not, right? Like, I hadn't even considered the thought of undergraduate research, anything like that. I was kind of just finished my second year of materials engineering and just kind of freewheeling and saying, hey, materials seems cool. I still have no idea what I want to do. And when I was in that lab, I met another graduate student named Stuart Guest. And then I was introduced to Patricio Mendez. And that was where it all started to click. And you've met Patricio, I'm sure, and had long conversations with the man. And his passion is infectious. And I'm sure in a very similar way to Gentry. Gentry got me into the door of the lab. And then after that, I was just kind of hooked. I had been in materials not really knowing where I wanted to go. I knew oil and gas was an option, but I really didn't know what I wanted to do within it. And as soon as I got involved with welding, saw everything that welding was, and really the interesting thing about welding in the engineering side for me is that welding isn't just a material science. It isn't just sort of like this heat transfer chemical type of thought. It is every single branch of engineering brought into one. If you don't know electrical to some degree, you're going to have a hard time understanding welding. And so everything brought into one is what welding represented to me. And that was sold to me by Patricio. And ever since then, I was hooked. So I started doing undergraduate research projects through the program with him, working with the graduate students, working with Patricio. And then I actually took one of my summers because I wasn't in the co-op program, so I didn't have job placements. At the time, I was working actually as a swimming instructor. And so I stopped working as a swimming instructor, even though it paid pretty well. But I was working throughout all of my undergrad. So I stopped doing that and I took a summer and I worked in the lab. And that was where it just clicked. And I was like, I got to do more of this. How do I do more of this? And so coming up to the end of my fourth year, which is where my degree was to be done, I was like, I wasn't ready to be done university. And I definitely wasn't ready to be done with welding. So I came back and I registered to do a master's with Patricio. It was 2 to 3 year program afterwards. And so I started that, and we ended up starting off sort of on a project I had already started in my undergrad. And then we started to go a little deeper. And Patricio one day was kind of talking about it and saying like, hey, like, we're going to go a little bit deeper here. There's some stuff that you could definitely gain. And we could eventually, if you're interested in doing the PhD, we could go that route. And so me being sort of in that comfortable space of the university, I wasn't ready to leave it yet. So I ended up just switching my master's over to a PhD in a very similar way to what Gentry went straight into the PhD, but I ended up just transferring over. And so that was what got me into that. And then through the PhD and everything that goes on with the lab is how I got involved with things like the association at the time, everything to do with the welding community. And it got me a lot of exposure. And through that, I actually ended up, right before I entered my grad studies, I ended up working for Weldco Beals in Edmonton here. And they manufacture essentially some small jib cranes and stuff, and then a lot of buckets for different pieces of Caterpillar equipment, essentially, right?
And for people that don't know, there's a lot of materials and engineering that goes into your buckets, and there's so many types of buckets. I worked for a large company that we worked in R&D on buckets, and when I got hired for that gig, I was like, oh yeah, big deal, buckets. Oh man, there's lots to know, and like where it is, what it's doing, what kind of earth, the earth hardness, the depth, solution, salation of water, like a million different things.
Yeah, no, it was a super cool job, and I only did it for 4 months because it was right between, hey, you graduated, you're going to go to grad school in the fall, and so I only did it for 4 months. But it actually formed a lot of lasting connections because the two of the people that were my bosses at the time, one was a VP and one was just the director of the engineering group there, have now actually come back into my life in different ways. And where I work now, the VP at that company is now one of the directors at the company that I work at now, and was one of the reasons why I chose to go to that company. So everything comes back around. But yeah, the welding lab was awesome for me. It was, you do a lot of things when you're working with Patricia, you do a lot of things that are not necessarily just pure research, but I really, really enjoyed it. It's one of the reasons why I enjoy my PhD so much. Was a lot of me likes, one of the thoughts of getting the PhD for me was always, hey, at some point in my life, I want to teach. That was always a thought in the back of my mind. It was one of the reasons why I went down that road, because if you want to teach in engineering, you have to have a PhD. It just is the way it is.
Yeah.
So both of my parents ended up as instructors at one of the technical colleges in the city here, NAIT. And I married a teacher. My sister's a teacher. So there was a lot of teaching happening around me. And there
You're
always
stuck.
yeah. So there's part of my mind that went that route. But the research aspect of it, I like research, but it was never, it was a way of getting where I wanted to get, but it's never been the fuel that has brought me along, right? Research is very interesting in its own right, but it requires a very specific mindset. And I really enjoyed what I did, but could I do that for the rest of my life? I don't think so.
Yeah, some people are built for it. Like they're just the way their brains work is research-based thoughts. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. So that was it was an interesting moment of realization for me that I was like, hey, this is awesome. If I want to come back to teaching at some point in my life, now I have that door open to me. And that is still something that I think about doing at later points in my career. But what I really wanted to do was, when you spend so long at the university, like I said, I was comfortable, but at a certain point, I got to a point where I was like, hey, I got to get out there. And one thing that I really, really like, and that research can do in a lot of ways, but I really like that aspect for my job now, is problem solving. Was always problem solving. And it's a big draw of engineering, is problem solving. And so I went down that route, and I've now graduated in 2017, so I've been out in industry now for about 3.5 years, all with the same company out at Supreme Steel. But yeah, it was an interesting little course of education, but a big amount of the credit and where my career path has ended up, and how I've shaped who I want to be as a professional, has landed back with Patricio. So I owe him one heck of a lot of credit, because he talked me into a lot of things. He would probably give some of the credit to me, but I think he deserves quite a bit of it. He's a special guy. He has that passion.
Yes. And I actually have been trying to wrangle him into a podcast, but he's holding off on me. So I actually think I got him on an angle, because we're both Spanish speakers. So we're both born in Argentina, and his wife is Chilean and my parents are Chilean. So he's got 8 grad students right now from Chile at the CCJW. And I was like, let's do a podcast in Spanish. And so I think we're gonna do it, and it won't be on the local or normal rotation. So for the non-Spanish speakers, don't freak out. But we might do it as like a special edition or something. I think that'd be a blast.
I think that'd be awesome. Yeah, no, he's a really, really good guy to talk to. His ideas and the way he thinks about welding is the reason why I got so excited about it. It is so unique in how he addresses it. And one of the things, actually interesting that you brought up the education streams earlier, one of the biggest things that a lesson that I learned from Patricio at an early stage, was that he had respect for welders. I would watch him at conferences. He'd be talking to a welder, and the welder might be saying something to Patricio that factually didn't make a lot of sense, right? The welder had made an observation, and he was trying to represent it to fact, which is pretty natural human instinct, right? Is you see something and you try to explain it.
Yeah.
And they would make that association. And I always wondered, because Patricio would never correct the guys. He would talk to them, but he would listen, and he would always listen to this. And I was always like, you are, if not one of the best minds in the world at this subject, like you're way up there, right? So why are you not correcting this guy? But I asked him about it one day, and he was like, that's the guy who knows. You put a welding arc in my hand, and I've watched the guy weld. He's a danger with a welding arc. But he's 100% right. It's that thing of having the mutual respect. Everybody has their place in the industry and in life in general, but within the welding specific industry, everybody has their place in their role. And pretending like you're at a different stage or better than a different stage because of what your education is or whatever it is just a straight up lie, right?
It's a fallacy.
Yeah, there's no way that like I can pretend that I can do the welds that our welders on the shop floor can do.
Yeah,
there's just no way. And
it's people's passions too. Like if your passion for something takes you down academia, good for you. But because someone's passion took them down and they're the welder on those buckets, that's not to say that they couldn't have been in the exact same place you are. They just didn't have that path or didn't choose that path. So there's no reason to discredit it. It takes all of us to make this thing work. And that's why I do the podcast. That's why I do the association, because it's all sorts of us. Like, I mean, I went to university for philosophy, dude. Like, my dream was to get my PhD in philosophy and be a university professor, because you can't do anything with philosophy. It's funny you brought up lawyers, because literally all my philosophy grad friends are all lawyers, because that's like the one job you can do right out of college with a philosophy degree. Meanwhile, I went to go weld because I had, needed to make money. And everything I've learned, and you brought it up earlier about welding, and I love that analogy of the intersection of knowledge in welding itself. If you want to look specifically at welding, like even if you want to bring it down to like a tight focus, and let's talk about like an actual weld puddle, like that singular moment of welding, how many types of physics, how many types of parameters, how many types of intersectionality are existing at this moment to make that work? That is an analogy for life, and that is an analogy for the weld career of all of us. We all meet at that puddle, whether it's the engineer working on the machines, the sales guy selling the rods, the development company on the materials and the fillers, the suppliers, and the person holding the torch. Everyone meets at that moment,
Yeah, no, it's an excellent analogy. And yeah, from the engineer's brain, it's that thing of, it's exactly that. You wouldn't get there with all those pieces. If you chuck out chemistry, or if you chuck out arc physics, or if you chuck out how the molten pool itself is flowing, you don't have a weld, right? Everything is there. You don't get a choice. You get to deal with all of it. Now, does everybody understand all of it? No.
Well, and do they have to? No.
No, that's the beauty of it. So yeah, no, it was very interesting. And now also funny that you bring up philosophy. I took all of the times that I had option courses, I actually took philosophy courses.
They're the best.
And
I mean, after the 100 level philosophy, for anyone that wants to go to school and spend some money, 100 philosophy, just skip it.
Yeah.
It's the one that weeds out the shaft from the seed. After that, 200 level and up, they're super fun.
Yeah. One of the things
if you're super nerdy, I have to throw the plug out. If you're super nerdy and you love math, take the philosophy of math. It's a fantastic course.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the best course I took in philosophy was actually, and it's informed a lot of my life since then, it was actually philosophy of logic, and it was all about fallacies. And
I got the book right there.
There you go.
Yeah.
I love that book, and it was one of those things that I actually had an interesting conversation with a colleague recently. It was one of the guys I went to grad school as well, and we had the conversation of saying, hey, like, you take some useless option courses as an engineer, and he brought up the point. He said, not useless, because the option courses that you took informed your life in some way, shape, or form, right? They added value to who you are as a human being. And who you are as a human being affects how you make day-to-day decisions. So yeah, you took a random geology course or wherever it was, or sciences course, or a humanities course, whatever it was, it affects who you are and who you are as an engineer. And it would do the same in any type of career path. So I thought that was an interesting perspective. It wasn't one that I had actually considered to a large degree before, but I was like, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense.
Well, there's no such thing as valueless learning. Like those are terms that don't go together. There's no such thing as having learned something that is without inherent value. It's just a matter of when that value will present itself. the moment when it presents itself, right?
Yeah.
But man, we're burning through time. 20 minutes in. It's time to take a break for our sponsors. Nairn, this is an awesome conversation. So thanks everyone for tuning in. This has been super fun so far. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back right after the break here on the CWB Association podcast. And we're back here. I'm Max Ceron with you on the CWB Association podcast. We got Naren Barnes here coming to us from Edmonton. He works at Supreme Steel and doing cool stuff. And we're just tracking the life right now of what's going on, from wanting to be a lawyer to not wanting to be a lawyer to getting into engineering and then falling into the world of materials. And then, well, meeting Mr. Dr. Patricio Mendez, which is a fantastic person, and the program that he's running out there is insane. Even just the website, you go in there, you can get lost just in the website, and that's not even a tip of what's going on there, right?
Yeah, no, the videos are always the drag-in point. It's I love watching. I love being able to when I was a grad student, especially, I love being able to show those videos to welders, because yeah, you get to see it as a welder sort of at that sort of macro lens scale. But when you actually get to see what the process you're doing is actually doing at that micro scale, I love seeing that realization moment, especially. And a lot of the things people get exposed to, they hear terms like droplet transfer and transfer modes and stuff like that. But when you can actually see it, it makes it mean a little bit different things, right? So
we were talking about, getting into the field at this point. So you've met Patricio, you have been pulled in, and you're working on your PhD. So I guess, did you finish your PhD? Are you now Dr. Barnes?
I am officially Dr. Barnes, yes. Although I typically tell people I prefer not to be called such. But yeah, no, I did finish it off. It took a grand total of 4 1/3 years. So it was an awesome thing to have accomplished, and it was an awesome thing to get to the end of. And it was, for me, a huge achievement, but it was an interesting moment too, because when I finished, I kind of had this moment of, now there's the what's next conversation, right? Because there's no clear path of, hey, you get your PhD, what do you do now, right?
Yeah. And that reminds me, that's actually what we were talking about, is about getting out there in the workforce now, and
Yes.
getting in there and figuring it out.
Yeah, so it's it was super interesting, because when I graduated, guys like Gentry had his sponsor company there, right? And it was, you're going to go work for them. And my sponsor company, so my research itself was on chrome carbide overlays, which is an important topic in Alberta, especially just because of its involvement in extraction and transportation of oil sands related things. And so I did a deep dive into that as a sort of product, and what it takes to actually, how it actually forms, and how the actual where can material within it forms. And so that was a very, very deep materials dive into that. But the sponsor company I had at the time, then in about the last 6 months of my PhD, actually closed their sort of business within chrome carbide overlays. They got bought out by a larger company, a very, very large, and I won't say the name, but it was a very, very large steel company. And they ended up closing that business down. So I had all this awesome research, at least I thought was really awesome research, and it would have helped me able to essentially tailor their product and make chrome carbide overlays specific to different situations. And the research kind of fell on dead ears at the end of the day, because the company was shut down.
So you're all dressed up for prom, and no one picked you up.
Exactly. So it was kind of interesting. It was slightly anticlimactic on that hand, but the research itself I was happy and proud of. But once I was done, it was kind of apparent to me that there was no door there, right? There was no, hey, you can go work for your sponsor. So what I did is I started looking around for different jobs, and there was a couple old graduates of the lab that had said, hey, come work with us, do stuff in sort of the engineering consulting type of field. And I thought that might be a good route for me, but I didn't want to start off in engineering consulting. I deal with now in my job a lot of engineering consultancies where there isn't knowledgeable individuals there. And that part of the job is always a little frustrating, because you're talking to people who haven't done the hard work of the experience and are just coming in and trying to apply theory to you. And you're like, yeah, but practical, think practical.
Yeah.
So I went to one of the companies. It was just sort of a job offer that had been flying around, and they were actually looking for a fully certified PN. So you need to work for 4 years as an engineer in training in order to get your PN. And you get 2 years of credit for doing your PhD, but you still have to work 2 years. And so I didn't fit the bill for what they wanted, but I went in and I interviewed for the job anyway, because I had this previous connection to this old VP. And sort of Patricio went out a leg and said, hey, take a look. And the guy who was in charge of the engineering department was a U of A PhD grad and stuff. So there was some connections there. And so I went and I went for the interview. And interestingly enough, I got told afterwards that the reason that I got the job, and they had a bunch of certified PhD people that came in, interviewed for the job. But the reason that I got the job is one of the parts of the sort of process of the interview is, I don't know if there's a guy who used to be heavily involved with the CWB called Thomas Bichond. I don't know if you ever interacted with him.
No, I don't think I know him. No.
Very passionate welder and quality inspector, smart guy. He was in the interview process, and his part of the interview process was he had a blank weld procedure data sheet, and he slid it across the table and he said, fill it out. And I kind of blank stared at him and said, with what? And he said, just a procedure that'll work. Put down stuff on paper. And so I was maybe naive enough, maybe brave enough. I don't know what combination of things, but I filled it out. And I had worked at Weldco Beals, and throughout my time in graduate studies, I'd seen weld procedures and interacted with them. And so even though I hadn't built a weld procedure before, I just started filling it out, and I knew what parameters would make a weldable thing at the end of the day. So I threw them on paper. And I guess I was the only one of the candidates who interviewed to actually attempt to fill it out. Everybody else said, no, we don't have enough information, all these things. So a little bit of maybe naivety on my side.
So I'm curious now, do you remember what you wrote down? Do you what was it, like a 70-18 fillet or something simple, or did you go all crazy like chromoly, Nairod 10% in a preheat post-heat situation?
No, actually, it was more or less the first one. What it was when I'd worked at Weldco Beals, we built all of our buckets mainly with MIG, right? And we used a particular wire, which was a Lincoln product. It was 50, and so, or L51, I believe. And so I knew what the parameters were that would make that relatively weldable. And so I just drew up a fillet weld procedure and threw it on the paper. And I don't remember the exact parameters that I put down, but yeah, it was just
at least it was something.
So yeah, it got me in the door. And so I started with Supreme, and they took a little bit of a chance, right? Because what it meant is that it left them in a lurch. They needed a CWB welding engineer on paper. And so the director actually went and pursued the certification himself. Even though he wasn't going to be able to spend the time to do the day-to-day tasks, he went and pursued it with the idea that eventually, once I got my PNG, I would take over that role within the company. And so the only difference is that his background was civil. So he was very good at the books enough to get his sort of designation through the CWB, and he could get his welding engineering certification through some of the history that he had, but he was by no means a welding expert. And so for me coming in, it was a little bit of trial by fire, because for a large part, I was driving a lot of the sort of progress of the welding side of our business and getting him to sort of oversee and check where I could with him. But it was a very, very interesting learning curve. But what it did establish was a large sense of independence, because I was the only guy doing what I was doing within my company. And there was other engineers in the company, but they were all working on either constructability or erection procedures or connection design or something else. I was the only one doing welding. And so it was an interesting transition, and it was kind of the hard way to learn, but I think it was a good way to learn for me personally, because it taught me to be more confident and assertive, because people were coming to me and saying, hey, we need an opinion on this. And I had also the advantage of having the materials knowledge as well, right? So I was able to make myself valuable to the company in two sort of aspects of welding and the materials side, because we would have the random problems where somebody would say, hey, we can't source this plate, we're going to use this plate instead. And then a client would come back and say,
no.
You don't get to. So then they would come to me and be like, hey, can you justify why we can use this plate? And I was like, all right, well, I wish I would have been informed before we told them we were doing it, but sure.
And you know, and this has come up a lot. So I've had a lot of engineers on the show. Okay. And some would argue perhaps too many. But I want to make it clear that in my life, I have worked with some amazing engineers and I have worked with some less than amazing engineers. All right. And the difference between the one to the other was the ability to respect the floor and be willing to go down there and get involved. So, you know, I worked with an engineer, and his name was Nick, one of the best engineers. He's an engineering manager now for a large team of engineers. And he, on his own, went and took a machining course at night. On his own, took an introduction to welding course in the evenings. And then on his own, went and studied and got his level 1 inspection. Doesn't need any of those. Literally just to get a better grasp of what the heck he's talking about. And then when he got promoted to an engineering manager, the projects we were working on through R&D and research were all like huge, and they're changing. Like, you know how lots of R&D stuff, sometimes things just fail and you got to just change gears completely and be like, what? We're going this way now. But he would always, once a week, his engineers would take turns, and they had their own lockers with coveralls and boots and gloves. Once a week, they had to suit up and go down and be the grunt for the people building the product. So the engineer would design it. They'd work as a team. It would hit the floor. Parts would be ordered. Everything would be cut, formed. Everything's starting to come together. And once a week, they had to come down. And no, they're not bossing anyone around. They're grinding. They're moving and seeing firsthand how it's working, but listening. You know, oh, these plates don't fit up. And you know what? 99% of the time, engineers have no idea how things go together. The welders just take care of it. They just make it work. This is a 1/4 inch out or an 1/8 out, or the gap's big, whatever. We make it. We make the magic happen. But having the engineer be there and witnessing it, they would take that back to the engineering room, being like, you know, these guys made it work, but everything was literally an 1/8 out. Like literally everything was an 1/8 out. Let's fix that. You know, and that's an amazing thing to do, and I think it's valuable. So for all the young people thinking about getting into engineering and going down that path, and we talked about it with Patricio, we talked about it with yourself, you know, respecting the trade means all aspects of it, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that one of the parts of my job that I enjoyed the most was it's difficult sometimes in an office environment. You don't really interact with everybody, especially in a company of Supreme size. Like, there's a lot of people in those offices. And now, being there for 3.5 years, I know everybody pretty well. And I'm a decently social human being, so I tend to joke around with a lot of people. But getting out on the shop floor was one of the biggest and quickest things I did, was just to get that interaction level and being able to talk with people. And it's not like I stop and I chat with every single welder. It would be pretty difficult. Sometimes we have like 150, but being able to have that interaction and being able to talk with them at an individual level is so much more valuable than just chucking something in an email and sending it along the way. Because you're 100% right, there's reason that these stereotypes exist for engineers. They didn't come out of nowhere, right? they're born from something along the way. And I think everything that you can do, especially as an engineer, to fight against that, to prove that, one, you're not supposed to be going down there and telling these guys how much smarter you are than them. It serves nobody any purpose, and for the most part isn't true, because you don't have that sort of hands-on skill. So it was one of the lessons I had to learn very early on, was whenever I design something, I always make sure that I've consulted with the guys actually doing it, whether it's a repair procedure or welding procedure, whatever it is. I always make sure I get that feedback, because ultimately I'm not the person who has to do it. And that is so valuable. And I got an early example of it on sort of the negative side early in my career, which was we had a certain welding procedure, and we had at that time a lot more shops. So Supreme exists as an entity across a lot of sort of Western Canada and Northwestern United States. So we used to have shops two in Edmonton, one in Saskatoon, one in Winnipeg, one in Vancouver, areas Delta. and then one in Portland as well. So we had a lot of shops. Since then, because of the being different reasons and trying to consolidate, those have come down a little bit in size, but we were spread out. And so we're trying to consolidate things. And so one of the things that came across early in the business is we're going to standardize our submerged arc welding consumables. We all need to be using about the same wire consumable and the same flux. And so they have these procedures at one of our other facilities. And so they passed that procedure along to the bridge facility in our Edmonton area. And they said, use this. And that direction came from up on high. And so it was just put on the shop floor. And the guys on the shop floor came to me one day and said, we can't hit these numbers. Like, it's a fillet weld procedure. We can't hit these numbers. And so I went and I looked and I did a little bit of math. It's pretty simple math. And I looked and I said, oh, it's theoretically impossible. As in, the amount of wire coming in could not produce a weld of that size. It was theoretically impossible. They were being set up to fail and then being asked why they were failing. And so it was one of those early lessons. And it was one of those things where I was like, I got to put a check for this on every data sheet that I ever make. So it was a good lesson and a good mental note. And luckily I didn't have to be the one to blame for it. But it was a huge realization of saying, hey, like, what you do at that decision level, especially when you have that decision level that affects, when I make a weld procedure data sheet, it doesn't just affect one welder, right? It affects all of them. So it's kind of that position of a little bit of influence and power, but it really is just, it's a responsibility for you to take your time and make sure you are making the steps to make it usable to them, right? Especially when it comes to things like repair procedures and how you do constructability. It's a massive consideration. Thinking things are easy in theory is very easy, but it's not easy in practice, right?
Well, and you want to leave enough room for, some interpretation too, because you don't necessarily know what the situation is going to be, right?
No, and actually one of the parts that I love so much about my job is that we do a lot of big scale things. We build bridges, we build high rises, we build big things. And I like that because you get to look at something or drive under something and say, I didn't weld that, but I had a hand in that. And my company had a hand. And that's cool. But it also means that when you're building big things, if you're out a millimeter on one side of a 40-meter girder, you're not out a millimeter at the other end, right? And somebody has to fix that to make it work in practice. So yeah, there's always those considerations.
Yeah. So, we're coming up onto the end of our show, which has been a little interesting here because it's in two parts for people that are listening. If it's a little bit weird 10 minutes ago, it's because my power died for some reason. So, but we're trucking along here in the world of online podcasting. But we were talking prior to the show a little bit about career paths, and you just mentioned something interesting, being like, engineers can get put into these categories where they, there's maybe some truth, but not all true. And we should fight those stereotypes, or question them and approach them and, deal with them. And the same thing happens with, the welder, and that's a thing that we're fighting lots now. And we're looking at, as an association, as a CWB group, of how do we get involved in the schools. Like, we're talking grade 5 now, to try to get these ideas in, because there's, I was just at a meeting yesterday where a company told me they're going to be short welders in the next few years. And I said, okay, well, how many are you looking for? They said 400. And I was like, okay, well, that's one company. Like, there's going to be, in the shipbuilding, they're talking thousands of welders needed in the next 10 years. So how do you fix that? If I say to a kid in grade 5 that's 10 years old, cool, check out this welding stream, he's going to get immediate pushback from certain people in his life that say it's dirty, it's dangerous, it's blah, blah, blah. And these are stereotypes that are not necessarily true. Sure, there are dirty, dangerous parts of it that you can go down, but that's not all of what it encompasses. And there's tons of perfectly clean, wonderful, high-paying jobs. And to be honest, most welding jobs are higher paying jobs than any other jobs. So even the worst welding job is still better paying than many other types of work out there. How do we get past that social stigma? And like, what I'm interested in what your thoughts of that. Like, what would you say to 10-year-olds or 15-year-olds about the trades, and you're coming from an engineering point, but maybe just in terms of the trades in general, what do you think?
It's a very interesting topic. And it's actually a topic I've had numerous discussions with, especially with my parents over the last sort of year or so. And it's just one of those things where when I was growing up, we kind of mentioned this sort of before the podcast, but when I was growing up, it was sort of this expectation level. And I don't think my parents would have loved me any less or anything like that had I not gone to university. But my mom was a university grad and I had a graduate degree. And especially at the time that she got her engineering degree, there was about 0 women in engineering, right? Just in terms of percentages. So her doing what she had done and getting a master's in engineering was, as a woman at the time, was very, very impressive.
It's a big deal. Yeah.
It was a huge deal. And so
Yep.
my sister went and did education, and she's a teacher now. And my brother went down a longer road, but a good road in the end of the day. He learned a lot through it. He's now a technologist. He got his construction management technologist. But he started off and he went and got a university degree. And his university degree is in classics and languages. So he was thinking about doing
I minored in classics. It's beautiful.
So, but the thing is, it's the sort of reality of it is you get out and there isn't a job necessarily, right?
That's
And
right.
for me growing up, there was always sort of that thing in the back of my mind, like, hey, you're going to university. That's what's happening. And I don't think necessarily that it is the best choice. I think in a case like my brother's, I think he learned a lot through the process and got to where he is now because he learned that maybe university was not the right choice for him initially. But I think that as a society in general, if you look at the rates of university educated people compared to 20 years ago, it's crazy. The amount of people with university educations is massive. And as a society, we tend to place weird values on it. You can get a mortgage more easily if you have a university degree, which, I mean, should the guy with a random biology degree get a mortgage more easily than somebody in the trades? Explain me the logic of that, because there's no biology factories. There's no guarantee of work there. So there's a lack of logic there, just to me personally. And I think that a lot of people who get university degrees could get to where they are, not necessarily through university, but through other programs, whether it be college or through the trades. If you want to work in a field where you get to build giant things, and that is sort of one of those things as a kid you might not recognize specifically, but it's sort of out there as a possibility. One of the projects we're doing right now, it's brand new to me, is we're actually working in marine. We've put our toes in the marine world now. We're building a ferry out in BC, and it's a completely different world. I'm having to learn to speak in a completely different language. We're having to get welders that can speak in a completely different language. It's very, very interesting, but you don't know where the possibilities of those choices can take you. And I kind of look at it as it's a choice in stability in some ways, right? Because we look at university educations as being very stable, is you have a guaranteed job. But that's true of such a small percentage of university educations. If you go to be a teacher, sure, you have a guarantee that you're going to be a teacher, but not really, because you got to get into a school district and do all these other hoops.
You get a substitute for X amount of time and you're making peanuts for money, and
there's always hoops associated with it. There's no guarantee. If you go and do like dentistry, sure, you're probably going to end up to be a dentist. But the percentage of people that start off with the goal of dentistry and end up there is pretty low. And it's not to say that you shouldn't take a shot because it's a low percentage chance. That would not be the message that I would spread. But what I would spread is to say we place a very negative impact on the trades, and especially on what we associate as poor long-term choices. So we're saying essentially, and there's some of those things there, the stigmas that exist that say, you're going to be a welder. Okay. So at 60, are you going to be able to stand up? Right? There's that sort of thing of your body's going to be put under that impact. But that isn't necessarily true. There are other venues within the industry. And to say that you're going to be upside down inside of a tank your entire career is a very short-sighted view of the entire thing.
It is,
and it's quite frankly a view that's not even really presented to children. Like, you guys are doing good work with the association to make that available. But for example, in my school where I grew up, granted I was out in the boonies a little bit, but that was never an option that was presented to me. That was never even a consideration. It was sort of like if the guys did a RAP program, which is what the sort of program was called at the time, where you would work in a trade throughout your high school part-time. And it was sort of, the guy did a rap program. It was kind of looked at as like, yeah, he's doing that now. He might make money, good money right away, but it's not going to last. Well, why? Okay, a guy's becoming a mechanic. Are you going to drive a car for the rest of your life? Probably. So what if it's electric? You're still going to need mechanics, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's that same idea. And I think welding is one of those subjects that people look at. And I think if you have no knowledge of welding whatsoever, you might look at welding as a science, as an application from a job level that might die. Because you might look at it and say, well, I've seen fancy welding robotics wherever I've seen them. I associate with that as something where what do we need welders for? Well, guess what? I think anybody who works in the welding industry is well aware that you can't replace welders across the board.
No.
And I think it's very, like I said before, the whole point of it is that short-sighted view of it and not knowing the other aspects of the industry. I know a lot of welders who have very successfully been welder for 10 years and said, you know what? I like welding, but I want to do inspection. Well, guess who's going to be the better inspector? The guy who came out from a different industry and got his inspection ticket, or the guy who's been welding for 10 years and then got his inspection ticket?
Yeah.
And what are companies going to hire? They're going to value that skill. And the proof is in the pudding right now. Like you said, the company's looking for 400 welders. We right now are outsourcing to make our ferry project work. We're looking to the boiler makers and the pressure vessel guys because we need a higher level of skill. Well, the reason that we're looking to those guys is because there isn't people coming out in droves from school that aren't being snatched up right away to other places and other jobs within the industry. So I think it's massively important that when you're presenting people the end of high school and saying, what's your next step? Well, I would guess that even myself, knowing I wanted to go to engineering, I didn't know what my end goal was. I had no idea. And I think that what you need to present is the thing of saying, well, one, don't rush it. I mean, there's a caveat to that, which is you can't not rush it too much. You got to do something. But it's also the thing of just having the ability to look at different careers with an open mind and learning when you haven't been presented with that to go and seek that information. And I think the good thing that the CWBA does is that it advertises that information. It tries to make it as available as it can.
Mm-hmm.
But I still think there's students going through high school who would be very, very happy and very successful going and getting welding certificates. And because of societal norms, they're being told that isn't a good future for you. And the reality is it's a complete lie. And one of the biggest things I got to see, even the story comes back to my mom's story, but even now being in industry, females in the welding industry are scarce.
Very.
And scarce for all the rare reasons, for all the wrong reasons, sorry.
Yeah.
It's still a very male-dominated field.
Mm-hmm.
And you still see that sort of very misogynistic attitude playing
very
through
much.
A lot of it. It's just there.
Mm-hmm.
And I see it with some of my colleagues too. It's unfortunate, right? Because you see people being treated differently for reasons that make absolutely no sense if you step back just a little bit. Yeah. And so I think that one of the awesome things that I've seen there was a high school in Edmonton, St. Joe's, that placed a large focus on getting females involved at a young age in welding. And actually, the proof is in the pudding. I'm sure a lot of people have heard this. They are very, very detail oriented and very often are winning welding competitions at a young age because they have a skill set that isn't necessarily met in other places, right? So I think that we, as an industry, have a lot of work to do in breaking down a lot of those barriers. But I think that also it's a societal thing, right? It's not presented as an option for women going out from high school and saying, you should do a trade. If you knew, like when I was going to school, if I knew women going into trades, it was looked down upon. And that is completely illogical. It makes no sense whatsoever because there's no reason for it outside of societal norms. That's it.
Yeah.
And those have no bearing in how people should approach their lives.
Yeah, I'm such a lover of history, and I think about this all the time, and it's exactly the point you're making. But if you look at a historical context, and I'm putting gender aside now because historically gender has been a problem since forever, right? But if you look at just the way we look at industry and the trades, 1,000 years ago, you went to school, and if you didn't like going to school and you had too much energy and you were like that kid that couldn't sit at a desk, they wouldn't force you to go to school. They'd say, you know what, go be a farmer or a construction guy or a whatever, because we can use your energy for something else and you will have a long, happy life doing something that you're built to do genetically. Because not everyone is built for sitting on their ass and watching a screen all day, right? Some people, and I'm one of them, right? I'm a high energy person. So I went to university and I struggled with sitting there. I'm not good. And it has nothing to do with intelligence. It's just like simple genetics. I'm just wired that way. Welding for me was like my savior, where I got to go and burn energy and work hard and get rewarded well with my income. And then a few years down the road, I decided to go back to school when I was more mature and develop the academic side of my career. And hand in hand, they've gone together awesome.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think that parents should think about. You have your kids, and my kids are grown up and moved out, and I lived this with them. If they like to study and be good at school, awesome. This is going to be a university student. They're just going to, you don't have to even push them. You know what? If you just disappeared today, they'll go that way on their own. But my other kid was running around at 1,000 miles an hour. And I never ever told him to stop. You like to run? Guess what? You're playing football and you're going to go into the trades, because you know what? People in the trades love people with energy, because we get up at 6 in the morning for work and we work 12-hour days. And if you want to work Saturdays and Sundays, that's overtime. That's $1,000 a day in your pocket. That kid's going to be all over it. You know what I mean? And that's what we should be doing. And in between then and now, somehow we put this value on education, where it was like, if you're not educated through a school system, you somehow aren't worthy of
Yeah.
being successful. And that's wrong.
Yeah, and the part of the school system that I think is super valuable is the part that shapes good human beings, right?
Mhm.
That's what it comes down to for me. It isn't the individual subject or whatever it is. It's you want to the end goal of education as a whole should be to shape good human beings. And at the end of the day, when you have something like welding, the real logical fallacy to me, to bring it back to philosophy a little bit, the real drop in the logic there is, how do you think things are going to get made? How do you think these things are going to happen? If the people
Mhm.
aren't there to do it, it isn't going to occur. And that's just reality. It's the same thing as anything else in life. If there isn't individuals who do that job, how do you think it happens? If you don't have garbage men, how do you think your garbage goes away?
Yeah.
Right? Automation isn't there to do that. So people have to do those things, and people genuinely can enjoy doing those things. And there's nothing wrong with that. If that's what makes you tick, great.
Yeah.
That's good, because it isn't what makes me tick, but that's fine. It doesn't need to be, right? Everybody has their own beautiful stream and they're allowed to follow it. But it's that you're 100% right. Is we've placed this value on education, in particular university education, where we've said, and I always find it ironic, people, when I have this discussion, which I have before, is people say, well, you got a PhD. Aren't you placing, that's ultimately, if you really step back, that's the highest level of education you could go for.
Mhm.
And I'm like, yeah, for me, great choice. I loved it. For most people, horrible choice. What value would it be if everybody had a doctorate? There would be
Yeah.
no value. What value
Yeah.
if everybody was an engineer? No value. Because you know what most engineers don't like to do? Actual hands-on work. So so it's that complete logic gap where it's like, you need people to do these jobs. Why are we discouraging them from doing these jobs? And the worst part is there is money there. There's good money in things like the trades. Really good money.
Yeah.
And for some reason, that's buried now. That used to be the big thing when I was going through school. It was always like, well, the trades will always pay well. And for some reason nowadays, it seems to be more buried, that it's sort of this, well, yeah, but that isn't the biggest stability you could have, or whatever it is. And you can pursue aspects of welding that are going to be super unstable. You want to be a deep dive underwater welder? Yeah, you're probably not going to find work every day of the week,
Yeah.
but you'll probably find work more than you'd think, right?
Yeah.
Like, those opportunities are out there. So it's very interesting on that side of it.
No, and that's totally true. And it's the stigma's tough. And let me tell you, as a brown immigrant kid in Canada that was welding, I made more money than almost anyone I knew because I worked my ass off and I couldn't get a mortgage till I was almost 30. Because and I'm watching 22-year-olds out of university with $100,000 of debt get a mortgage because they have a chemistry degree.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you kidding me? I made 80 grand when I was 19, and you're not going to give me a mortgage, you
Yeah.
know? And that's the stigma. It's like, oh, what do you do? I'm a welder. Well, sorry. And it's like, are you like, what more do I have to do? And
Yeah.
those are those social barriers that people put up, and we have to knock them down because everyone's entitled to a good life, you know?
Yeah, and it's funny. My dad was born in India,
Hmm.
and his family came from India. They went to England, and then when he was a teenager, and then they eventually ended up in Canada. And my uncle, who's now passed away, but good man, was a tailor, and that was his passion in life. And he worked for
Hmm.
the longest time at a tailor shop, making suits and all these things. And did he have a stable life in some aspects? No, but he was a happy man because he was passionate about what he was doing, right?
Hmm.
So it's sort of reminders that people are brought by their life path. Like some of his life path, was he necessarily influenced by his travels and stuff and all those things? 100%. But we shouldn't be telling kids not to do things. Like, should you become a professional skydiver? Maybe not. Maybe that's not one we tell kids to do at a big
Well,
base.
why not? I'm sure
But
they
why
make
not?
great money.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, sure. But it's those other careers, especially the trades, that I think have a very negative stigma. And it's interesting that we feel that even in provinces like Alberta, where arguably we're one of the most focused in that way, we're not as associated with other mindsets. Like places like BC, you tend to associate that with a different mindset. But Alberta is always like that oil and gas kind of mindset that people associate with us. Not
Mhm.
always true, but I think that it's interesting to see that same sort of stigma coming through in a province where arguably we have the largest sort of drive to say, hey, get your head down, work,
Yeah.
right?
All right, Naren. Well, we've gone way over time. I get in trouble all the time for talking too much. My marketing guys freak out. They're like, "Man, we're gonna have to start breaking your shows into part one and part two." So that might have to happen. But this has been a great conversation with you. I'm gonna ask you one last question, and I know sometimes this one leads off, and you've probably heard me ask the other people on the podcast. But what's a piece of advice you would give to somebody coming up right now, graduating high school, looking to get into the trades? What's of a piece of advice? One singular piece of advice for success.
One singular piece of advice for success. Um, it's an old trope, and it's a trope that's prevalent in a lot of different careers and different things. But my biggest piece of advice is the same as what I was taught, which is be a lifelong learner. If you at any point in your life feel that you don't have anything else to learn, you're wrong. And there's no two ways about it. It's not that
Hmm.
you're right in a certain sense. Maybe this subject area, you're the perfect person for it. No, you can always stand to learn, and you can always stand to grow as a human being. And I think that that's the most important piece of advice. And it's what leads people to change their career arcs. It's what leads people to new experiences. Lifelong learner is the biggest piece of advice that I could give. It's never shut yourself off to new opportunities. Never shut yourself off to new knowledge.
All right.
It's less of an opportunity.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Naren. I appreciate having you on the show. Thanks again to all the listeners that are making the show a huge success out there in the media land. Podcast is doing super well and we're trending up. And that's what I love to see because we're all just about stories and we're about you and I and the people out there in the field from all sectors. Anyone that's interested on being on the show, or if you know someone that would be cool to interview, send them my way. You can always find me on Instagram, AskMax75. My email is max.ceron@cwbgroup.org. And make sure you download, share, and follow us on all our social media. And Naren, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you, Max, for having me. This was a real treat.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, everyone. And make sure you stay tuned for the next episode next week. Talk to you later.
We hope you enjoyed the show.
You've been listening to the CWB Association Welding Podcast with Max Ceron. If you enjoyed what you heard today, rate our podcast and visit us at CWBAssociation.org to learn more. Feel free to contact us if you have any questions or suggestions on what you'd like to learn about in the future. Produced by the CWB Group and presented by Ceron. This podcast serves to educate and connect the welding community. Please subscribe, and thank you for listening.